COVID-19 was not the great equalizer. It was the great wake-up call. Hundreds of billionaires saw their net worth increase by more than $1 trillion over the course of 2020, while we saw families struggling to put food on the table and roofs over their heads. In this next session, let's reimagine economic systems for a transformed and inclusive future, starting now. These conversations will unite the champions of both top-down and bottom-up strategies that are redefining economic growth and economic dignity. First, we'll hear from Hadler Thomasdottir, CEO of the B Team, a group of courageous business and civil society leaders working together to transform business for a better world. And Hadler will be joined by Fast Company's staff writer and host of the World-Changing Ideas podcast, Talib Visram. Then we'll pass the mic to someone who is passionate about serving African entrepreneurs in order to drive development as Africans define it. Co-host of the Solvers podcast, Guhe Mwara. Guhe will be chatting with Emmanuel Faber, the co-chair of the G7 Business for Inclusive Growth Coalition, which gathers more than 50 multinational companies with total sales of some $10 trillion to focus on living wage, diversity, and inclusive supply chains. And to wrap us up, Talib will come back to chat with two fantastic guests, Rula Sighire, writer, community organizer, and strategist at the International Domestic Workers Federation, which represents more than 600,000 domestic workers globally, and Vera Songwe, the first woman to lead the Economic Commission for Africa in its 60-year history. Here goes.
Hi there, thanks so much for joining us. My name's Talib Visram, and I'm so excited to be talking today to Hala Thomasdottir. We're going to be having a conversation today about inclusive economic systems, such an important topic in today's context, of course. Hala, welcome. Thanks so much for the chat today.
Thanks for having me. It's my pleasure and honor to be here.
You know, Hala, having kind of watched some of your earlier work, I love this kind of iconic quote that you keep coming back to. It's an Einstein quote, I think, that talks about this idea of status quo and this idea that if you keep trying the same thing over and over again, it's kind of insanity to think that you're going to get a different outcome.
Indeed.
So, you know, in the context of where we are now with the kind of economic systems that we have in place, that seems pretty apt, right? This idea that if we keep the status quo, nothing's going to change. And we've seen that during the pandemic. You know, the world's billionaires have got, you know, amassed riches while there's been mass unemployment and losses of income and recessions. You know, what's kind of your vision of an inclusive economy, and what makes you think that since the status quo is serving the ones at the top so well, that things are going to change?
Good question, and not an easy one, to be honest, but I think I want to just start by saying it's very clear to me that we need an economic reset, and our governments have a role to play in that. I think it's very clear to me that we need to reset who is in leadership in order to change how we lead and do business. And it's very clear to me that it is no longer possible to face the interdependent crises that are in front of us by thinking that business can do it alone, or governments can do it alone, or civil society has the answers without working with the other stakeholders. So I think we need to reset how we lead and co-create the path from what I would call the shareholder primacy era, the era where we thought making financial profit for the shareholders or owners of companies is the only and sole purpose of business. A theory put forward by Milton Friedman 52 years ago, and it's time to declare it over. And it's time for the stakeholder inclusive economy era. And I believe most people realize this, but I don't believe we are coming together to upgrade and reset our systems and our leadership to deliver meaningful action on that vision.
You know, you mentioned Milton Friedman, and you know, in places like the US, where I'm located, you know, this idea of free market capitalism is so deeply ingrained in the culture. You know, you talked about kind of being from Iceland, and Nordic countries may have kind of a more sustainable, compassionate form of capitalism. Is that translatable to other places such as the US?
I often get this question, and it's a very good one. And I often want to ask another question when I get this question, which is it possible or plausible to continue on the path that the US is on? Because we're so deeply divided and we can't agree on anything, and we clearly are not enjoying shared prosperity on a healthy planet, and facing weather events every day in our backyard, facing deep divisions, leaving so many people behind that frankly there are no jobs on a dead planet, and there is no shared prosperity for anyone, including business, with broken social contracts. So I would say yes. No one in the Nordics think we live in socialistic system, even if many in the US would like to maintain that we do. We all think we live in a free market capitalistic system, but we choose to practice capitalism with care for people and the planet. And I believe that is the only plausible way forward to do business and actually deliver shareholder value as well, because there is no business beyond planetary boundaries, and we are fast exceeding many of our planetary boundaries. And there is no business in a world where people don't want to work anymore because the social contract doesn't feel like a win-win anymore. And look at what's happening in the US today. We have about 10 million open jobs and about 9 million people roughly looking for jobs, and yet we can't close the gap between those two. And I would say there's evidence here, sometimes being called the Great Resignation, that people no longer feel that what business offers is a fair deal. And so I think business has both the duty and the responsibility and the opportunity to redefine what it means to do business and what it means to deliver a stakeholder capitalism in practice. And it has to start with placing humanity at the heart of everything you do. And I also believe the health of our planet needs to sit right alongside that. And I think those two are needed to deliver profit long term. So I don't think it is an either or conversation anymore. We just have to redefine how we practice capitalism and end the shareholder primacy and really accelerate this transition to stakeholder capitalism, or towards delivering an inclusive economy that works for all of us.
And obviously leadership is so important. You talk about humanity as being really the core of a new system. Would you say a strong moral compass is really the key kind of trait for a leader these days?
Good question. I would say having a moral compass is essential for leadership today. And I don't know that you can deal with the world we live in without it very effectively. So as I see it, a moral compass is the first step you take if you want to be an effective leader, or if you want to build an organization that has long-term viability. We have unthinkable events happening almost every day in the world that we live in. And so I think a moral compass is both the guidance that you need to stay strong and stay the course, just like if you were on a hiking trail, you need a compass. And I also think it is a source of resilience. If you're very clear about what your purpose in this world is as an individual or as an organization, and you're very clear on the principles that are going to guide your journey as you navigate this complex reality we live in, then you can stay the course and you can stay true to what is truly your inner voice and values. And I believe as humans, we agree that we want shared prosperity on a healthy planet. But when we go into our roles, become CEOs or board directors or even activists or government or serve in public service, I think we too often take the role more seriously than our true inner voice. And I think the moral compass is what should be and ought to be the go-to place to anyone who wants to call themselves a leader, be it in a formal leadership capacity or an informal one, because I believe there's a leader inside every single one of us.
So what advice would you have for people? Like you said, there's a leader in every one of us. What advice do you give people who don't have the power or resources or platforms, who want to get involved, to get involved? It seems like it's kind of a difficult thing to do without those things.
Yeah, I think it's such an important question, because Talib, we all have power. And perhaps the least unlocked power in the world today that is highly dysfunctional is our inner capacity. And I think every single one of us ought to ask ourselves, who are we not to be in service of delivering this better future that we need, in service of delivering the global goals that were agreed to? It's the highest order of objectives we have in the world, and over 195 countries agreed to deliver them. And yet so many of us are finding ourselves frustrated by the lack of progress and waiting for other people to deliver it. I don't think we can wait. We have to unlock our own leadership, our own voice, our own values in service of this greater good. And everyone has power. It sits inside of us, but we also have the power of the purse, who we do business with. We have the power of choice, who we work for. We have the power of the vote. We have certainly the power of choosing where to put our energy and attention at a time that really needs us to be what Desmond Tutu used to call prisoners of hope. Because in a world that we are in today, it is so easy to lose faith in the future. And the day we do that, we lose the opportunity to design the future we want and need. And so I think we have to choose hope. I think we have to choose to unlock our own leadership, our own voice, our own values, and our own worth in service of delivering this future we desire as humans. And I think that desire is quite seared. I no longer meet people who say business as usual is an option, or shareholder primacy is something we should double down on. I think most people have had a great awakening during these difficult times we've been through. But I think we are struggling with systems that have not been upgraded or reset. And they will only be upgraded and reset by people really leaning in to all of us having a role in doing so. Governments should write the rules or reset the rules of the economy. Business should really reset who is in leadership, because we can't change how we do things with more of the same. I sometimes call it pale and stale. That's the crisis of conformity. And I think civil society should hold us to account, but I really call on those in civil society to try to be bridge builders, because none of the solutions we need are going to happen in isolation with business leading the way or government leading the way. We need radical collaboration at this moment in time, and then we can deliver and design and dream a future that is even beyond our wildest dreams. It is within reach, but it is ours to choose.
Just a final question for you, Hala. You mentioned the role of government. We've seen some kind of progress in public spending in rebuilding after in response to the pandemic. But at the same time, countries have been very nationalistic, for example, in their approach to vaccines. Is there hope that the international community can come together? Because I assume you need the world to come together to build something. You can't do it kind of piece by piece.
There is absolute hope. And I do believe the difference between now and, let's say, the global financial crisis in 2008 is that there has been a great awakening. I don't think any one of us is untouched by the things that are happening around us. So that's the good news. I would be lying if I said I was really inspired by the global collaboration when it comes to, for example, the vaccine efforts against the COVID-19. I'm not. We need to do so much better. But I'm incredibly inspired by lots of local initiatives that I see where people are being brought together. And recently I saw an example that I'd just like to share here in the end, where Harley-Davidson, a company that is in the middle of Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where there are deep troubles across all of the crises that we all know of, brought together with their partners from the local neighborhoods, brought together all of its stakeholders in a reset dialogue on how to build on their strong history, more shared prosperity and healthy community going forward. So I believe we no longer can just wait for global collaboration to work better or work at the level that we need it to. It needs to work better. We also should just be looking close to our own ranks and figure out how do we lean in and work together across multiple stakeholders to co-create and deliver the future we so desperately need and also as humans really want.
Absolutely. Hala, thanks so much. This was fun. It was like a lightning round, but
it's so quick. I'm sorry I'm probably too long-winded in the answers, but I hope we got to some of it.
No, not at all. Thanks so much, Hala.
It was my pleasure, Talib.
Hello, Mr. Faber. I'm really excited to be in conversation with you today, and I'm happy to kick us off So in many ways, we're still in the midst of this pandemic, and it's really exposed the entrenched inequalities in our economic systems. So while many have had their livelihoods destroyed, a handful of billionaires have added about $1 trillion to their net worths. When you think about the kind of systemic change that we need to see in the market economy, where do you think we need to start?
Thank you, Igwe, and thank you for this conversation with you. I'm really pleased and honored to be part of it today. And I think your question is very difficult because it's where we start, but it's also where we continue, where we double down, where we stop. And to me, it's very clear that this pandemic has shown that market economy is not able to tackle long-term changes when, in particular, they need to happen in an accelerated and coordinated manner. And the growth of inequalities that you mentioned through the COVID crisis, for me, is a clear case for some systemic change. I think the growth of inequalities is like a time bomb. We see that in democracies, but I think we see that also in the more global market economies. And we need to tackle, as we tackle the climate crisis, I think we need to tackle the social inclusion and the social transition clearly as a priority.
So I hear you talk about this ticking time bomb. What do you think the role of business is going to be in addressing this ticking time bomb? And if you could also talk to us a little bit about the Business for Inclusive Growth Coalition. Who are you and what are you trying to achieve?
Yes, well, thanks for asking. I think business is an essential part of the solution. Without business and economy, nothing can happen. So business needs to be incentivized, markets needs to be regulated, but fundamentally, I'm a fundamental believer in the fact that social market economy is the fundamental part of the solution. Now, Business for Inclusive Growth is a coalition that we created during the French G7 presidency in 2019, which gathers about 50 very large multinational companies. Total sales equals more than $1 trillion, more than 3 million employees around the world. And we've basically started this coalition as a way to bridge microeconomic experiments about more inclusive supply chains, more diverse workforces, and the macro policies that can exist, in particular because we have hosted this coalition of businesses at OECD, which does secretariat in partenariat with the Business for Inclusive Growth team. One of our immediate through COVID topic that we took was living wage and decent wage for all our employees. And I can tell you it was interesting to bring so many Asian, European, US-based companies to agree on this question of a decent wage, which has been debated for years and years, really. And I was super proud that at the end of the day, the board last summer agreed that this was going to be our guideline. Another topic is obviously responsible restructuring and making sure that we do not increase the inequalities within companies through the restructuring, the reorganization, the transition that needs to occur, both as part of the post-COVID transition, but also the climate transition that's going to happen. So personally, one of the things that as the chair and CEO of Danone, one of the companies in this coalition, have done is that we have used both the Gini and the Palma ratios within the company to benchmark the way we were going to assemble any restructuring plan, making sure that post this restructuring, our Gini or Palma ratio would actually be improved and not deteriorated. So I think it's essential that we show that there are concrete business experiments that can be done and that are going against the natural wave of the short-term interest of the market.
So I've heard you described as one of the world's boldest leaders, and I can see why, just given some of these experiments that you're already running. As you are using your platform quite publicly to really push for more inclusive economies, what do you think the cost of inaction or silence on the part of business leaders will be, particularly around inequality, but also the climate crisis?
Well, Ningi, frankly, huge cost. And clearly what I think is still missing, but I think is making progress, and that's why I'm a stubborn optimist and activist on these topics, is metrics. What we're definitely missing as businesses, as investors, is agreed metrics on what we call ESG, which at the end of the day is all about the SDGs and how companies can relate to SDGs in their strategy and in their decisions. So the fact that as we speak, the US, the EU, the IFRS are working super fast in putting together ESG metrics that would apply to all companies internationally, at least the ones that are listed and that are reporting through IFRS, I think is of the essence. Because yes, you will always have some quote unquote more progressive or for whatever reason companies or leaders prepared to go one step ahead of others, and it's great. We need these pioneers, and they don't do that because they want to save the world. I think they do that because they believe that it is good for their companies to do that, because it builds ultimately competitive advantage. I'll just give you one example. When Danone became an entreprise à mission, so a public benefit corporation under the French law, in 6 months' time, our ranking into the students' preferred companies in France jumped by 20, just 20 ranks. So if you believe that getting the right talent in the future is going to be important, this is why we do that. So fighting for inequalities is also a matter of fighting for what the next generation wants. And they want companies that are dealing with SDGs, that are dealing with the transition, both social and climate. And this is why it also builds a competitive advantage. So you will have these people and these companies that are ready or have realized that, or they are in a business situation or an industry where there is a real need and a call for action. But you also need to create this level playing field that cannot happen without the fact that there is one definition, one standard against which everyone can be measured, and therefore investors in the future will be able to choose not comparing apples and carrots, but apples to apples. And once you're able to do this, you're also able to build the incentives for finance, for portfolio managers to actually not only be incentivized on their EPS growth or on the stock value growth of their weighted average portfolio in a given quarter or a given year, but also on a set of the equivalent metrics on the ESG. And as soon as you can do that, you start resynchronizing the finance, the capital markets timing with the need for transformation that takes some longer term investments by companies. So I think it's absolutely crucial that we all support our multilateral organizations, the accounting standards, the government, to adopt such metrics in the months to come.
So that was actually my next question was going to be, for those of us who aren't CEOs of large corporations, what do you think meaningful action is that we can be taking right now, particularly against climate change and what's coming down the line?
Yes, well, let me put it this way. I think leadership is not a factor of power. CEOs and political leaders get their power from a mandate that's been given with a term, with a scope, with objectives, which in companies comes from the board, that comes from shareholders, in democracies or others come from the people, elections, in other systems from other kinds of elections, but you have a mandate and you have power. It does not mean that you are a leader. A leader is everyone that actually challenges its own or her or his own statu quo, ready to take a risk because you're ready to, you fundamentally believe that this is the right thing to do. I'll just give you, an example. I see all around the world, and in particular here in Europe, but way beyond that, young employees that are creating collectives of employees, gathering several generations of employees in their large companies, and they start acting as inside activists within their own company, pushing management to take action, and they start aligning ones with the other. So it's these new ways of collective action which I truly commend, and I makes me fundamentally, again, optimist on the fact that you can't only rely on CEOs and on political leaders. At the end of the day, I think what we are relying on is this whole generation that realizes that we are in this moment where we need to change. And again, each of the small changes that happen in everybody's life is making a change to this world. So we are all part of the same community. And again, I think the COVID is a huge example of how interdependent we are all, one from the other. And I take this as a big lesson that what I'm doing here in Paris impacts what happens in New York, in Shanghai, the way I travel, the way I have wearing a mask or not. So it's a huge moment of collective responsibility, I think.
And that gives me hope as well. I think there's a South African concept, the concept of Ubuntu, the idea that we are only people through other people, that our humanity is collective, and this is the only way that we actually can make a difference. It's incredibly hopeful. This has been great. These are the end of my questions. This has been such an insightful session. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much for inviting me. All the best to everyone.
Thanks so much for joining us. We're talking about inclusive economies, economies that work for everyone. This is the local portion of our inclusive economies discussion, where we're considering two groups that have been particularly affected economically by the pandemic and how they can build back. We're looking at the continent of Africa, and we're going to be talking to Dr. Vera Songwe about that. And then we're looking at the plight of domestic workers, and we're going to be talking to Rula Seghaya about that. So I'm so glad to welcome you both. I'd love to start by just quoting a World Bank figure. The World Bank said that COVID-19 may push 40 million Africans into extreme poverty. And another report by McKinsey said the jobs or incomes of 150 million Africans are vulnerable. That's a third of the entire labor force. Dr. Songwe, we keep hearing this phrase that, we need to rebuild now that we're coming out of the pandemic. We're not really coming out of the pandemic. It's still raging on. And in Africa, only about 2.3% of the population have been vaccinated. Experts have said that most will have to wait till 2022 to be vaccinated. While it seems like vaccinations are a health issue, they're clearly an economic issue, right? Can any economic rebuilding be done before the population is vaccinated?
Thank you for that question, and a pleasure to be with you here today. I think your answer is, the simple answer is no. Of course, we are working very hard to vaccinate all of the population. We are actually looking at Africa getting into a third wave, and countries like Kenya are actually getting into a fourth wave. And so vaccinations remain a critical part to reopening our economies. You have set the statistics yourself. Less than 5% of the continent is fully vaccinated, whereas in the developed world, we have 60%. So it's easy to talk about recovery if you're in the developed world, but In Africa, we are still looking at how we do that. I'm happy to say that the Economic Commission for Africa, working with the Center for Disease Control, the African Center for Disease Control, and Afri-Exim Bank under the leadership of Strife Masiwia, has been able to procure 400 million doses of Johnson & Johnson, which is a one-shot vaccines dose. And that should take care of 30% of the continent. So our challenge now is to see whether we can actually use those vaccines, should they become available, to vaccinate 30% of the population before December. Yes, the grim statistic of Africa having to wait until late in 2022 to get vaccinated is not acceptable. And this sort of dynamic world, the divergence that we're witnessing on vaccines, cannot lead to recovery. And we must remember that recovery for Africa is recovery for the world, because we're traveling. And so if Africa is not fully vaccinated, I think the rest of the world remains under threat as well.
Right. I'd love to take everyone back to the very start of the pandemic, where, at least in the US, I'm sure a few other countries, we had this routine of clapping for essential workers in the evenings, for doctors and for, restaurant staff and grocery staff who were doing amazing frontline work. But one group of workers, domestic workers, seem to kind of have been ignored in this whole graciousness. Rula, I wonder if you could kind of take us through why domestic workers who were also frontline workers may have been kind of ignored, and what needs to happen for them to recover from the pandemic.
Thank you for that question, Talib, and thank you for having me here with you today. It is a very tricky dilemma to tackle, because domestic workers specifically fit more than one vulnerable group. We cannot be ignoring the fact that most domestic workers are women. Most domestic workers are from the global south. A lot of domestic workers are migrants, and most domestic workers are Black, Indigenous, and people of color. So those are many categories that usually end up being in the bottom of the food chain of the current economy, the vicious capitalist economy that we have. And we cannot ignore the fact that there is racial capitalism manifesting itself within the sector of domestic work. For example, for decades, the darker your skin, the less you get paid in informal sectors. Also, with the rise of the pandemic, we have witnessed the rise of anti-Asian racism as well, with domestic workers from Asian backgrounds being treated as vectors for the disease. It is because of these complex identities and the need for us to work collectively and intersectionally that we need to uplift the domestic work sector together, not only working on labor laws, but also working on countering xenophobia and working on making that rhetoric that you are mentioning of essential workers inclusive of domestic workers who are upholding a big chunk of the care economy and doing a lot of direct and indirect care. Yet again, when we think of care work, we're mostly thinking of people who had access to some form of formal education, such as nurses, such as doctors, but domestic workers are part of the care economy. And if we want a caring economy and not business as usual when we build back better, we need to recognize that.
When we look at policies that could help rebuild the economy for both these groups, it may seem like, policy enough, it may not be as simple as policy enough. Policy alone, excuse me. Dr. Songwe, does Africa need to rely on the global community, international community for resources before it can build back better, before it can self-rely and become more self-sufficient? What does Africa need from the international community?
I think three things. The first one is Africa needs from the international community that the international community listen to what Africa wants. And this is an important point. We saw at the beginning of the crisis with under the collaboration of the Economic Commission for Africa, African finance ministers met and suggested that what we needed, first of all, at the time, we didn't know how long this crisis would last. What we needed, first of all, was a temporary reprieve on debt repayment. The G20 listened, and we got what we call the Debt Service Suspension Initiative. We also we were the first ones at the Economic Commission for Africa to call for issuance of special drawing rights. Today, we know that $650 billion of special dwelling rights have been issued. Africa is now asking that 25 to 30% of those special dwelling rights be on lent to emerging market economies, including Africa, of course, so that we can use that to respond effectively to the crisis. So the second one is financing, but we want financing based on how Africa defines it, and not so much, the world saying, okay, this is what we think. We asked for special dwelling rights, we only got 5% of them. We need more, a little bit like the vaccines again. This divergence in response, right? A global good was produced, but Africa only got 5%. On the vaccines, only 5% of Africa is vaccinated. Seems like a bad sort of habit happening here with Africa. And then finally, I think that Africa also needs, internally to work on its governance systems, and that the rest of the world needs to acknowledge some of that work. So it's not just what Africa needs from the world, it's what Africa needs to do for itself so that Africa can become part of that. And then, of course, Africa does produce and does provide a lot of entrance into the global supply chain. Today, we talk a lot about ICT and technology being, the way to recovery. Let's remember that almost 80% of the primary resources that get into a lot of the ICT products come from Africa. So we need better, trade systems and trade agreements for us to be able to get in. And on the other side, better regulation on technological innovation and property rights to protect the innovations of our youth.
Yeah, Rula, you've written an entire policy paper about recovery for domestic workers. So there's so much to get into. But one thing that stood out to me was that you mentioned that domestic workers should be at the policy making table, right? There should be representation for them when making policies. Have you seen that work in any countries anywhere in the world so far? Have you seen that taking place, or are there any kind of positive examples that we can learn from?
Absolutely. There are positive examples, which makes us believe that what is lacking is the political will. We are not lacking solutions because essential workers, informal workers, and domestic workers have brought a lot to the table, and they are reframing the world and reframing the economy. And all we need to do is listen. And as per the ILO's 5R, we need to recognize, redistribute, reduce, reward, and represent workers and their labor, especially feminized and racialized forms of work. What we have seen successful in the past, just this year, it's the 10th anniversary of the ILO Domestic Workers Convention. And in June, when that anniversary has happened in Argentina, domestic workers acquired a big gain that was the fruit of their lobbying, which is an increase to their salary by 42%. A law has been passed that initiated that increase. In South Africa as well, currently domestic workers are protected by the COIDA. So they are able to access health and safety at work. And the private household is understood as a workspace, which is quite revolutionary as well. Another example from South Africa that we have seen work is what has been a struggle for domestic workers in general is even to be included in trade unionisms and labor movements, because they were the last to sort of join, because recognizing a woman's labor, especially in the domestic sphere, not as something that comes in naturally to her as part of her womanhood, but as a form of labor that needs to be recognized and compensated, came in quite late. So South Africa was not able to only rally people around that cause, but to be part of the minimum living wage within the country, which in many different countries, people struggle to be included within such frameworks of minimum wage because the sectoral salaries are much lower than any other form of payment that happens to other workers. To quote our president, Myrtle Whitboy, what we want is the same thing that other workers have. It's very obvious, very clear, and it should be put on the table.
Yeah, just to follow up on something, we talk about the work that domestic workers do as the care economy. There's a lot of women doing care economy work who are not being paid. But they contribute, massively to society. Should there be a model whereby they're getting paid directly by governments? How should that look?
Lovely that you ask, because this has been also a struggle, historically in the 70s, when women asked for wages against housework. to make the point that domestic work needs to be compensated. The way we look at it is that we lack social protection, and by social protection, meaning social services, social assistance, and social security in general as workers and as people, because governments try to displace the weight of what should be care institutions onto individuals who are informal workers and domestic workers. And by creating proper care infrastructures, so an affordable education, affordable housing, affordable social health services, and not having a healthcare system that is designed to kill those, again, who are at the front line of every crisis because they cannot afford medication, would alleviate those burdens. It would redistribute the domestic burdens when everybody is compensated and when access to care institutions is affordable and equitable.
Dr. Songwei, I'd like to ask you about policy as well. Kind of a similar question. Africa is such a huge continent, so diverse, so many different countries. Have you seen any policies in any countries in Africa that you think are kind of positive examples coming out of the pandemic? Whether they're tax policies or any kind of rebuilding policies that the rest of the continent could look at.
No, thank you. There are so many. There are maybe too many to name, right? We're 53 countries on the continent, and I think almost every continent, every country has been able to put in place one or two very good policies. So let me just name a few. I start with, Ghana, for example, where you talked about in the United States, clapping for essential workers. Ghana did better than that. Ghana went ahead and decided that all health workers in Ghana will receive free health insurance for themselves and their family, because of course at the time, and still COVID is taking away lives, and the people at the front lines of the COVID fight are our nurses. And so the government of Ghana decided to put something like this in place. In Kenya, we launched the e-voucher system. The Kenyan government launched the e-voucher system, which essentially means women and children have access to a basic package of basic necessities. In Egypt, the government of Egypt decided to take care of 30% of the electricity bills of most of the small and medium enterprise members of society. In Senegal, more school feeding programs were scaled up so that the schools that stayed open when there were sort of reopenings, knowing that a lot of those families came from, a lot of the kids came from families that could no longer feed, school feeding became the essential point where at least every kid was getting 1 meal a day. So I think in Togo, we saw that the government also suspended all tax payments from small and medium businesses, particularly businesses that were redirecting their production to support sort of the production of COVID paraphernalia. So I think, in Cameroon, COVID testing was made free so that, people could go ahead and test voluntarily to ensure Africa was losing $29 billion from lockdowns a month. And so we needed very quickly, and many of these economies needed very quickly to find ways of responding in different ways to this kind of crisis and this kind of shock. So I've given you a few examples, but there are many more and we could go on and on. But I think one of the most important things that was also done was to ensure that there was good information about how one could, test, trace, and most importantly, prevent, getting the disease, because as we said earlier, only 5% of the continent has access to vaccines.
Thank you. And Rula, I really have to hit on this because it's so important. About 1 in 5, if my stats are correct, domestic workers are migrant workers, right? Kind of leaving their countries to do domestic work elsewhere. What's at the root of this problem? It seems to me, obviously this policy needs to change, but at the heart of it, is it that the home countries need better economies, need more inclusive economies in order to kind of stop that, the drain of people leaving the country?
That is one of the obstacles that pushes people towards migrating and finding better, more decent lives elsewhere and entering the workforce. And it's usually much easier to enter the informal sector with the state of xenophobia and racism within the given countries. Even though they keep blaming the migrants for stealing the jobs, they're isn't anybody who's willing to take on these jobs because these jobs lack protection. But other factors also include climate change. A lot of migrant workers are fleeing their home countries because of certain political situations, but because of the diversity of the visa types and the ways that people can access or cross certain borders, those migrants are treated differently. They're understood, some of them as labor migrants, some of them as refugees, some of them as asylum seekers, and it all depends on practically what socioeconomic class they're coming from and whether one government is willing to understand them equitably or not. The trouble is that if we believe in the moral equality of people, they should be able to cross borders and seek better livelihoods elsewhere. And when they do so, they contribute with remittances to their home countries. So the way we see it is that it could be a situation that's beneficial for everybody, but we do need to work on the infrastructures of the countries of origin and also on the inclusive mechanisms within the countries of destination, alongside with migration pathways that are safe and that do not criminalize and do not punish these migrants who are already suspect of so many other systems, and they are treated already as suspects as they trespass these borders. Like, their lives need to be made much easier because their remittances also contribute to the economy of their home countries.
Thank you. And I'd love to finish off where this has gone so quickly, but Dr. Songwe, I'd love to finish off by asking you, there's this eternal question of, when countries receive resources, how do we make sure it gets into the hands of the people? I covered this story about the Togo government that partnered with the nonprofit Give Directly, and they're kind of finding the poorest individuals in Togo using an algorithm and directly transferring cash to those individuals using very simple phone technology. What do you think of those kinds of options? Is that a good way of making sure that people get the money?
Clearly, I think in the situation of a crisis, it's important that resources get to where they're needed the most, the fastest way possible. But I think, as we've been hearing from Rula, we cannot just do this independent initiatives. There must be institutions that support these initiatives. There must be institutions that can carry them for the long term and make them sustainable. So while one-off cash transfers on a phone are important, I think what we need to do is do things like what Tunisia or Kenya is doing, is institutionalize it, have ministries of finance, ministries of social welfare work in unison to make sure that these people then actually have a legal ID, that they have access to a savings account, that there is a traceability process that allows governments to ensure that, yes, we believe that things can go off on phones, but we do need to understand, either through a census, where exactly we are, if we wanted to come back and do an impact analysis, can we identify and find those people? What are the institutions that can help make that one intervention, not just the one-off, but part of a global, if we're giving you resources, are your kids going to school? Are you getting vaccinated? Are you following your health procedures? I think we need a system that allows us to do all of that. And it's only institutions that can deliver that kind of comprehensive process. IT, of course, helps because you can do all of this on an IT platform and bring them together, have one unique identity, like India or Estonia, but you do need strong institutions behind that.
Great. Well, there's so much to talk about, but we're out of time. It really seems like there needs to be some sustainable change, and that now's the time to do it. Thank you so much, Dr. Songwe and Rula. Really appreciated having you both.
Thank you, Talib.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
So just to recap, I think that really now is the time that inequities need to be addressed, and those that are excluded from society need to be addressed. If we can't address this now, when we've been through a world-shattering pandemic, or when we're still going through a world-shattering pandemic, I don't know when we will. The one thing that discourages me a little bit is the kind of nationalistic, inward-looking response that a lot of countries have had to the pandemic, and we can see that in the vaccine situation. we talked to Dr. Songwei about how few of the population is vaccinated. Developed countries essentially have hoarded the vaccines. There was this COVAX system, which essentially guaranteed vaccines to poorer countries, and that kind of was essentially ruined because of the hoarding of vaccines. So we really do need the international community to help. We need to be more external looking so that countries in Africa, for example, can be more self-sufficient and produce internally for the long term, for the next time that a pandemic comes about. And when we do that, I think, as Hala said so well, humanity needs to be at the center of rebuilding economies. That could have helped with the vaccine rollout, for example. It could have helped with building better safety nets. So when people were losing their incomes, losing their jobs, they had money to fall back on. So I think humanity should now guide the policy. Why don't we look at happiness as a metric of progress instead of GDP, for example? How can you look at the state of domestic workers with humanity at the core and not be urged to do something about the industry? I also think that diversity is going to help us build more inclusive economies. As Hala said, I love this phrase, no more male, pale and stale. Sameness is really a threat to inclusivity. And this is true in the public sector too. If we need women in business, we need women in policy making too. And that's the reason Rula was very clear about, there need to be domestic workers, 92% of whom are women, at the table when policy making. And that goes for racial justice too, right? The whole reason that domestic workers are excluded from labor laws, for example, is because of racist history. So we need more representation and diversity. No size is going to fit all. We talked with Hala about, Nordic capitalism is different from American capitalism. We talked about how different countries in Africa are going to respond differently. And clearly, developed countries and developing countries are going to respond differently. But I think that the biggest message is that we need to come together. My take is we need to come together, be less nationalistic, and really embrace rebuilding infrastructure, rebuilding economies together, because Lord knows that the next pandemic is, probably going to come up at some point, and we're going to need to know how to battle it.